Hello, bros. Back with Edgar Allan Poe, Alien Angel. The poet Edgar Allan Poe, Alien Angel. Get that off there. What the hell do they make these things with anymore? All right. Get that set up. Taste the beer. Pumpkin beer from last year. All right. Put the time in there. Pot chew. Chapter chew, pot chew. Thumbnail. Alien Angel. Come on. Done. Change. Poe. Save. And we're just about ready. What do you got, buddy? You're the number one tonight. You're number one, buddy. You got it all, Bubba. All. Ready for some Poe and some beer? Look, buddy, there we are. All right, pause that bullshit. Open the chat-arena. Let's get on with this butter churning bullshit. Yeah, buddy. Hell yeah, number 1 and 2. How did he take over as number 1? He must have more seniority. We're on part 4 of chapter 2, even though it's technically part 2 of the whatever this is. The work that Foley illustrates and in illustrating explains Poe's poetics is not one of the prose essays. It is the prose poem Eureka. Mind you, I have no clue what 90% of this book has said so far. Given Poe's poetry and poetics, it seems inevitable that he would try to work out a strictly poetic vehicle for representing the theoretical truth of poetry. Prose, the traditional discourse of information and fact, would appear prima facie the wrong medium. By contrast, because information and fact are indispensable to the discourse of historical studies and natural philosophy, the newly emergent and representative discourses of Poe's world, they were also prima facie essential. Eureka is grounded in that basic tension. Whatever that is, this book just, I don't know. At one time, rarely engaged in a serious way, Valerie's essay being the outstanding exception, Eureka has more recently enjoyed a number of important and searching analyses. It is a key document in Poe's poetics because its argument is the philosophy of composition, performative rather than expository. Both show that the truth about poetry, its meaning, does not answer to the question what, but to the question how. Horace's Ars Poetica and Pope's essay on criticism supply much more truthful models for a discourse on poetics than Aristotle's Poetics or Kant's Third Critique, or for that matter, than the explanation I am trying to fashion here. Well, no shit. Like Horace and Pope, Poe's work assumes that a prosaic exposition will distort poetic truth. tempting readers to make a conceptual rather than an experiential engagement with the issues. He declares Eureka's poetic allegiance at the outset. I offer this book of truths not in its character of truth teller, but for the beauty that abounds in its truth, constituting it true. Holding a candle in sunshine was how Blake saw prosaic conceptual approaches to works of imagination. The remark throws into relief the difficulty of trying to explain poetry. Carefully parsed, however, it tells us where to hold up our candles. In the prosaic darkness where critics and scholars struggle to improve our collective powers of reflection. Indeed, Eureka seems to me, as it has to many others, such an unusual and even such an epical work that we get furthest when we try to lay out the simplest things that we think we know about it. I almost should pull out the book of Poe's works and read it beforehand to see what he's talking about, since I don't even know the poem. What makes Eureka a poem, then? Or let us ask, how does its poetry get made? The questions are especially pertinent because Poe's prefatory declaration, like the body of Eureka, is written in prose rather than verse. The problem goes deeper than the manifest contradiction in the phrase prose poem. Eureka is a work full of declarative facts and information, not least the declaration that it is a prose poem and a book of truths. If it is a poem, what is the status of its facticities? The force of that question gets underscored when we reflect on the two most obvious poetical features of Eureka. The first is its adherence to consistency as the measure of the formal beauty of its truth, because information and facts operate within a correspondence theory of truth, not a coherence theory like Poe's. How do those facticities function in Eureka? The question becomes more pressing when we reflect upon the engine that generates the beauty that abounds in Eureka. Joanne Diane calls the engine the analytic of the dash, that is, the biographical figure that generates the abundant digressions, emendations, transits, and linguistic conversions that comprise the body of the poem, presenting a decentered world of unlimited turning and breakdowns, Diane observes. Poe restructures a new space. The dash is Eureka's sign of extreme capability, Diane 64 through 65. Eureka itself gives a different name to the engine. Beauty abounds through the leap, paragraph 14, toward second order, facticities, or sets of relations intuitively achieved and then deliberately expressed and elaborated. Let me see if I can pull out this book here and find this motherfucker. The works of Poe. Let's see what's in there. Poems. Here we go. See if Eureka's in there. Maybe you want to see too. Maybe you'd like to see too, buddy. Thanks for your help. With what, buddy? What the fuck is Dr. Monshine? Who are you, bruv? What you want? Eureka is in here. No, El Dorado. Israfel. El Araf. For Annie. The Bell's an enigma to my mother. I don't see Eureka. Yeah, Eureka's not even in here. Dr. Monshane. Eureka is not in here. Let's see if it's in this other book. I thought I had the full works. Where the fuck is... Oh, wait. That's the Raven edition. Let's see what's in this bullshit. The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The Balloon Hoax. No, it's not in here. So I'd have to go upstairs and find it, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do it, bro. Who the fuck is Dr. Monshine? Ever come to my channel and say some stupid shit like this? Ever. Dr. Monshine. It's a wolf. I don't know. Just some fucking weirdo, I guess. What do you got, bruv? What do you got? What did I help you with? Tell me now. Or you'd be sent to Tartarus. In that context, Eureka is declaring its allegiance to a mode of poetics that became widespread in the 19th century. For European literature and culture, the fonds at origo of this approach, I don't know why they put these foreign fucking phrases in, it disgusts me, was Childe Harold's pilgrimage, which mapped its poetics to the imaginative representation of Byron's actual travels in the European and Mediterranean world. But the poem is far less a travelogue than it is a performative investigation into the nature of poetry. Why did I lose my spot here? Develop a new kind of poetry. There it is. Tapping the emerging discourses of historicism and ethnography, Childe Harold's sweeping historical and geographical facticities developed a new kind of argument for poetry's global relevance. At its core was the romantic figure of the poet, the hitherto unacknowledged but now loudly proclaimed legislator of the world, because the poet is the master of the world's discursions. The Byronic phenomenon marks Kant and Hegel as the end of the authority of classical philosophy. Romanticism would license imaginative experiments with other literary forms as vehicles for investigating the new master discourses of poetry and poetics. Hoffmann, Holderlin, Pushkin, Musset, Hugo, Browning, Nerval, Rossetti, and Lautréamont provide notable instances. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, for which Poe had a deep, if also deeply critical, admiration, is especially relevant because its facticities are theological and philosophical. That is to say, ideological. In like manner, Poe's flight of imaginative theory takes off from conceptual facts and scientific information rather than, like Byron's flight from the circumstantial facts of a lived history. This entire tradition is important to recall when reading Eureka, lest we approach Poe's work as philosophy, or worse yet, as science. It is fundamentally, as Poe said, a prose poem, but it constructs itself around and through the discourse of what was called in the 19th century natural philosophy, more specifically, a particular and popular region of a 19th century lexicon and methodology. Eureka raids the archives of science and cosmology for a language and a syntax that could replace the language and syntax of religion and transcendental philosophy. Susan Manning once shrewdly observed, "The prose of Eureka simulates the process of mind in the act of self-discovery." Manning 239. The remark draws our attention to the action rather than the content of the language, an approach that Diane would brilliantly elaborate a few years later. But when we reflect that Manning's comment might as justly be said of, say, Emerson's essays, we see the need to qualify her insight. For the discourse of science, certainly of Poe's sources in natural philosophy, commits itself to proposing non-subjective processes and discoveries. More accurately, perhaps, its processes map to an order that is larger than the poet him or herself, larger even than a poet conceived in Coleridge's ideal perfection. A significant index of that encompassing order is the poem's reader, always a prominent player in Poe's work. Paradoxically, the subjective voice of Eureka's poet becomes an equally important index. How the reader and the author function in Eureka is strikingly clear in two of the poem's most arresting rhetorical moves. The first comes at the outset with the letter from 2848, found on the mare tenebrarum of human consciousness. What's up, Robs? This is Poe's farewell salute to the rhetoric of hoax that he had often found so useful for his work, a critique of contemporary 19th century philosophy and philosophical method. This letter from the future is nonetheless a strictly historical critique whose limited and personal character is emphasized by its double genre. It is an epistle, and it is a parody. We want to remember that while Poe recognizes how different persons exhibit different levels of intellectual and imaginative awareness, he does not recognize an historical progress or ascent of consciousness. Pundit and pundit's recorder may come from the distant future, but they are still poor forked creatures like everybody else, including Kepler, Mill, and even those maligned eminences whose name pundit is so grotesquely misremembers. The second rhetorical move is at the end of Eureka and comes once again as a quotation. In this case, the recorder of Eureka reports on the low voices of memories from some immemorial past. Addressing the reader, the poet says that I have spoken of memories that haunt us from our youth and pursue us even into our manhood. Now and then, paragraph 265, then, which is also to say now, the poet illustrates how these memories speak to us with low voices, saying exactly what is then now quoted as the last paragraph of Eureka. Like the manuscript found in the bottle at the outset, this quotation makes an imaginative figure of objective confrontation. Here the low voices address both the author and the readers of Eureka in order to speak of the eternal working of that divine being in which all creation is here said to participate. Everything in Eureka is thus to be understood as a saying or a speaking, or when the poetic figure gets lifted from the physical to the mental order as a supposing or a fancying or an imagining. Variations on those projective works control Eureka's discursive representations. They make a harmony with the words now and here, which mark the opening sentences of more than 20% of Eureka's 266 paragraphs, defining the continuing present of the poem's action. Because the core of Eureka's continuously present speakings and supposings comes from the poem's first person author, the letter from the future and the voices from the past are important devices for locating Eureka's first person in a trans-temporal epic named by the ancient memories, the night of time, when a still existent being existed. As the final paragraph unfolds, we see that the epic is not measured by time, but by individual intelligences, animal, vegetable, and mineral, that live through the long succession of ages of consciousness. That phrase, which climaxes the paragraph, plays a cunning game with the English root of the word succession, and the syntax of its prepositional phrases. The temporality marked in the phrase long succession of ages, my italics, is undermined when we take the phrase ages of consciousness as a nominal phrase modifying succession. In that perspective, the word success gets torqued from the word succession in order to expose the difference between a long succession of ages. A pure temporality and a long succession of ages and consciousness. A human temporality, like the frequent iterated versions of the word suppose. Eureka sports a dazzling set of variations on the word succession. In a nice rhetorical touch that introduces another sign of objectivity into the poem, a footnote gets attached to this portentous paragraph. It calls our attention to a relevant earlier passage, paragraph 187, where Eureka's poet makes a dramatic claim upon supreme intellectual authority. In that case, the issue is strictly astronomical, whether, given what is known and not known about our particular universe of stars, one may infer the existence of multiple other similar universes. Clusters of stars, carefully laying out the scientific evidence for the existence of multiple universes. Poe shows that such could in fact be the case. Eureka has in fact elaborated its possible conception. But Poe is not interested in making a scientific claim or building a fact-based scientific model that could be tested as a device for making astronomical discoveries. I am aiming less at physical than at metaphysical order. Beyond Poe's model of cosmos, its second-order facticity, lies his principal object, the truth of an impossible conception. In paragraph 187, he declares that truth by explaining by what right a person will infer an interminable succession of the clusters of clusters. I reply that the right, in a case such as this, depends absolutely on the hardihood of that imagination which ventures to claim the right. Let me declare only that, as an individual, I myself feel impelled to the fancy, without daring to call it more, that there does exist a limitless succession of universes, more or less similar to that of which we have cognizance, to that of which we alone shall ever have cognizance, at the very least until the return of our own particular universe into unity. If such clusters of clusters exist, however, and they do, it is abundantly clear that having had no part in our origin, they have no portion in our laws. They neither attract us nor we them. Their material, their spirit is not ours, is not that which obtains in any part of our universe. They cannot impress our senses or our souls. Among them and us, considering all for the moment collectively, there are no influences in common. Each exists apart and independently in the bosom of its proper and particular God. If such clusters exist, however, and they do, that is not the truth of science or philosophy or religion. It is the truth of poiesis. It is the power to create not ex nihilo, not nihilo, but by consistent extravagance ex cathedra, recalling Archimedes shouting Eureka as he leapt from his bath. Poe named it the leap of an intuition that, once taken, laid an obligation upon its agent to bring it to fulfillment. In the present case, to write Eureka, whose elaborate series of suppositions and fancies build up a model of a particular universe. Eureka becomes one of the possible plots of a god, and its singularity is licensed by the facticities it takes up as its material constraints and quiddities, created by the volition of the heart divine, of a still existent being divine being, this heart divine is revealed in the fullness of the actual bibliographical time of Eureka, as our own. The prefatory paragraphs of Eureka, number 1 through 6, set out the subject Poe means to speak of, as well as the ruling idea of the poem. The subject is the physical, metaphysical, and mathematical of the material and spiritual universe, of its essence, its origin, its creation, its present condition, and its destiny. The leading idea is that in the original unity of the first thing lies the secondary cause of all things, with the germ of their inevitable annihilation, all italics being Poe's. In reading Eureka, both statements should be understood in poetical rather than philosophical or scientific terms. The first statement, therefore, describes the poem's primary lexicon. The second, the poem's view of the rules, the syntax that order and patrol any deployment of the lexicon. Poe's pronouncement about this material and spiritual universe, that it is a plot of God, annotates his poetical understanding of Eureka's materials. Crucially, a fact not observed even by the poem's best readers, Poe's universe is a plot of God, not the plot. The great truth-telling virtues of poetry, as opposed to philosophy or science, is its ability to expose some metaphysical and meta-conceptual truths about the human world by deploying that carefully designed singularity we call a poem. Eureka is a model of the universe, quite like what Charles Saunders Peirce would soon call an abduction of the universe, because by the law of this human imagination, the universe should be understood as one, entire and consistent, a kind of secular translation of the Catholic creedal formula unum sanctum Catholicum, though Poe might rather have thought, after Horace, simplex dum taxit et unum. So far as the action of Eureka is concerned, then, Poe's leading idea gets transformed into an illustration of how an individual impression of the universe is possible. My general proposition, then, is this. In the original unity of the first thing lies the secondary cause of all things, with the germ of their inevitable annihilation. In illustration of this idea, I propose to take such a survey of the universe that the mind may be able to really to receive and to perceive an individual impression. Eureka enacts this encompassing mental surveillance for the benefit of the mind of the reader. It is an illustration, a model of how an individual mind receives and perceives an impression that it is once individual and total. Two words dominate the organization of Eureka's poetic representation, now and most important of all, suppose, in various forms of noun, verb, and adjective. The poetic action is not offered as a discovery, but as the conscious representation of a discovery process that is already understood. Childe Harold's Pilgrim, the Prelude, Frost at Midnight, Ode on a Grecian Urn, all these are romantic poems of their first person self-discoveries and, as such, are presented as open-ended, unfinished works with something evermore about to be. Byron's publisher urged him to write more cantos of Childe Harold, and the Prelude was thus titled, not by the author because it was exactly that, its further parts having never been completed. The first person of Eureka, by contrast, takes the same view of his works as the author of the Philosophy of Composition and The Raven. In the drama of Eureka, the speaker's identity, with the action and the reaction of the divine will, emerges to the reader's view as a climactic revelation of a godlike poet whose volition to supernal beauty and order is as clear and predeterminate as it was to the author of The Raven. But Eureka, like the universe, is an entire singularity, a poetical model drawn from a particular discourse field, but it unfolds as a singular universe in a cosmos of other universes, and that larger perspective illuminates the multiple singularities that make up Eureka's special universe of stars. For the poem is as much a summons to other individuals who inhabit its particular universe, its readers, as this song of myself. This fact appears with special clarity when the model of Eureka's dynamic cycle of attraction and repulsion has been completely worked out and matter collapses into absolute unity. Addressing us directly, the poem asks, "Are we here to pause?" It then answers itself, that is, it addresses us, its participating agents. Not so. On the universal, conceive that a new and perhaps totally different series of conditions may ensue. Another creation and a radiation returning into itself, another action and reaction of the divine will. Guiding our imaginations by the omniprevalent law of laws, the law of periodicity, are we not indeed more than justified in entertaining a belief, let us say, rather in indulging a hope, than the processes we have ventured to contemplate will be renewed forever and forever and forever, a novel universe swelling into existence and then subsiding into nothingness. At every throb of the heart divine. And now, this heart divine, what is it? It is our own. Let not the merely seeming irreverence of this idea frighten our souls from that cool exercise of consciousness, from that deep tranquility of self inspection, through which alone we can hope to attain the presence of this, the most sublime of truths, and look it leisurely in the face. Consider the first person plural in this passage. It marks Eureka as not just a poem, but an oral poem. And Eureka, we want to remember, was initially presented as a lecture. A notable feature of the poem's rhetoric is its quietly intimate address. Not so, let us say, let not, and most arresting of all. And now, this heart divine, what is it? It is our own. The rhetoric appreciates that the revelation may prove startling for some readers, even fearful, but it installs a counter rhetoric of fearlessness by its pervasive, cool exercise of consciousness. The most sublime of truths is more than a justified belief or an indulged hope. It is now constituted in this moment of fiat lux as non subjective fact. Eureka thus works up a theory of cosmos from the discourse of contemporary natural philosophy. But its subject and governing idea, which Poe specified at the outset, are what we elsewhere would call its thematic upper current. Its thematic undercurrent is not a scientific theory, it is a poetic theory. Eureka elaborates a detailed model of poetic expression, supposititious, fanciful, and imaginative, out of a discourse field of contemporary prose, fact, and information. Eureka's nebular model of cosmos is an objective correlative for a theory of poetry that Poe regards as appropriate to the lingua franca of a post-Enlightenment world. In assessing Eureka, then, it is helpful to recall the important distinction Poe drew for poems written in rhyme between verse and poetry. The prose elements in Eureka and its facts and information, as well as the syntax of their representation, correspond to the versification of rhyming poems, or what the rationale of verse called their scientific music. Poe judged that contemporary science provided the material means, most particularly the nebular hypothesis, for representing the fabled music of the spheres, the expanding clusters of Eureka that correspond to the novel combinations of combinations generated through poetic action. Eureka is often praised and dispraised for its science. The judgments coming from the perspective of later, more advanced scientific views. While we want to take the exact measure of such historical differences, we should do so in philological terms, just as we take the measure of the differences between the Renaissance discursions of Spencer and the modernist discursions of Pound. Much as they admired and even imitated Shakespeare, neither Byron nor Keats actually speaks his language, least of all his poetic language. Judging Eureka's success or failure in relation to its science is then aesthetically mistaken. It violates the fundamental rule laid down by Pope to begin our readings in that same spirit that the author writ. Spirit, clearly signifying what we should now call the discourse field that is actually in play. Such a philological understanding also makes accessible the discursive features in writers who may seem, as we are wont to say, in advance of their time. When Poe is judged, as he often is, a modernist or proto-modernist writer, that is the perspective being taken. It registers the commonplace of cultural studies that every historical moment is pregnant with futurities, and that certain writers are their midwives. So readers have seen a forecast of modernism in the severe formalism of Poe's style. They have also found clear anticipations of a Big Bang cosmology in Eureka. As well they might, since the anticipations are latent possibilities in Poe's contemporary materials. Poe draws them out, leaps to them by his supposititious poetic style. In that move, the poem's most distinctive Eureka makes what may be its most startling forecast. Toward the method of scientific discovery, Charles Saunders Peirce would soon call and explain as abduction. Hypothesizing as an as yet unrealized truth or conclusion, you test its adequacy by building out a model of greater and greater particularity. You build a dome in air and observe whether it can survive in the environment it requires. Poe recognizes the fact of abduction, what he calls the intuitive leap, paragraph 14, in the acts of certain persons like Kepler, but he writes Eureka to argue that it can only be properly explained, as opposed to actually executed, by imaginative simulation. Eureka is Poe's leap of abduction to the possibility of an explanation of the leap, or what he calls intuitive knowledge. It is a simulation representation of how knowledge and truth are acquired in fact by executing the action in theory, that is, in poetic imitation. Like Peirce a few years later, Poe is arguing that while deduction and induction are methods for verifying knowledge, they cannot generate new knowledge. Poe dismisses both as creeping and crawling modes of thought. True knowledge is gained by abductions, imaginative intuitions, guesses, leapings, to recall and reconceive a well-known remark of Keats, by irritable reachings after fact and reason. As Peirce would later argue, abduction is the method by which science is able to imagine that what it doesn't already know or think it knows to be true. Neither Peirce nor any other philosopher or scientist could prove or demonstrate the truth of anything we don't already recognize as truth. What we do is abduce recognitions and then submit them to rigorous tests. Abduction shows the possibility of a certain state of affairs, and by elaboration of a model raises or reduces its statistical likelihood. For its part, poetic abduction unfolds in a discourse of imitation, not a discourse of information. As such, its special office is to verify the possibility of the truth of intuition. Insofar as its argument is abductive, it implicitly takes the following form: because Eureka is a fulfilled model or imitation of the action of intuitive or imaginative knowledge, it expresses the truth of that kind of knowledge in the only way the truth can be expressed, as a representation or performance of the action. 4. The catastrophe of beauty. Of Eureka, scholars do not often observe that its climaxes at a vision of cosmic catastrophe. The paragraphs that follow the catastrophe comprise an imaginative effort to comprehend and explain it. But this catastrophe, what is it? Focused on Eureka's post-catastrophic reflections, scholars double down on the problem by dealing almost exclusively with Eureka's final paragraph, where low voices draw up an explanation of the catastrophe in the language of an epic in the night of time. As that very phrase suggests, the language of the voices is far removed from the language of Poe's 19th century. It is Neoplatonic and theistic. Poe gains a signal poetic advantage by turning to such a language. It supplies the poem with a discourse that can talk easily, indeed, in terms of the larger purpose of Eureka, too easily, about temporality. Speaking thus, it flees altogether from the poem's other imperative focus, the here and the now of what the voices themselves recognize as a still existent being. In mortal terms, a person living in the midst of Eurekan catastrophe, or even more particularly, Edgar Allan Poe. Reading Eureka's conclusion primarily through paragraph 266 avoids both its catastrophe set forth in paragraphs 246 through 47 and the, so to speak, authorized explanation of the catastrophe, which he begins in paragraph 248 and climaxes in paragraph 264. We will get a clearer view of Eureka and its poetics, I believe, when we shift our view to those neglected passages. The catastrophe itself is described in a language passed along to Poe by Kepler, Newton, Humboldt, Laplace, and others. He does and does not mention. Since Poe's subject, its upper current, is what we would call a moment of cosmological heat death, the vision is, if it's strictly scientific, also apocalyptic. Then indeed, amid unfathomable abysses, we will be glaring, unimaginable suns, but all this will be merely a climactic magnificence foreboding the great end. Of this end, the new Genesis described can be but a very partial postponement. While undergoing consolidation, the clusters themselves, with a special, prodigiously accumulative have been rushing towards their own general center, and now with a millionfold electric velocity commensurate only with their material grandeur and with their spiritual passions for oneness, the majestic remnants of the tribe of stars flash at length into a common embrace. The inevitable catastrophe is at hand. In the continuing present, Eureka has continually insisted upon. It is, however, but a moment of chaotic precipitation of the moons upon the planets, of the planets upon the suns, and of the suns upon the nuclei. It is only one moment because Eureka's upper current is bearing witness not to the catastrophic death of the cosmos, but of the universe of stars. The cosmos itself is immortal. The heat death of the universe of stars is dreadful and terrifying, however, because it is the figure of death that can now both possess and overwhelm the human imagination. The inevitable catastrophe is the great now, the awful present, the existing condition of the universe. Shakespeare conjured exactly the same event in a very different language. I am dying, Egypt, dying, Antony and Cleopatra. For the congruence leaps from memory to attention when we compare how Antony and Cleopatra characterize Antony's death with how Poe thinks about the death of the existing condition of the universe. Reflecting on the scientific truth of universal catastrophe, Poe calls his readers to take what is essentially a philological view. He begins from the familiar allegorical trope about human beings passing from youth when a person has no true experience of death to manhood when we awaken from the truth of that dream. At first, Poe is reading in broad historical terms. The shock of the realization leads to a compensatory reaction against the onset of doubt, surprise, and incomprehensibility. Eureka then quotes what they say, the voices of tradition, to mitigate the fear of death. You live, and the time was when you lived not. You have been created, and intelligence exists greater than your own, and it is only through this intelligence you live at all. But Poe, in propria persona, rejects the ancient wisdom. These things we struggle to comprehend and cannot. Cannot because these things, being untrue, are thus, of necessity, incomprehensible. Why? Because of the fact that no one soul is inferior to another, that nothing is or can be superior to any one soul, that each soul is, in part, its own God, its own creator. In a word, that God, the material and spiritual God, now exists solely in the diffused matter and spirit of the universe. And that being the case, in this view, and in this view alone, we comprehend the riddles of divine injustice, of inexorable fate. In this view alone, the existence of evil becomes intelligible. But in this view, it becomes more, it becomes endurable. Our souls no longer rebel at a sorrow which we ourselves have imposed upon ourselves in furtherance of our own purposes. With a view, if even with a futile view, to the extension of our own joy. Upon the factive experience of death, injustice, and evil, we impose a mournful and never-ending remembrance, assuming a burden we choose to bear, knowing all the while that the burden is beyond bearing, except as an attentive remembrance, which is as much as to say, in the dialect of Shakespeare, Antony, not Caesar's valor hath overthrown Antony, but Antony's hath triumphed on itself. Cleopatra, so it should be that none but Antony should conquer Antony. But woe, 'tis so. The catastrophe is not the fact of loss, injustice, and death, nor even, in the words of Eureka's final footnote, the pain of the consideration of those actual human conditions. For the experience of that pain can be the very emblem of the triumph of a cool, transmortal consciousness. But for poetry and poetics, woe, 'tis so. Poe has made apocalyptic catastrophe the truth of poetic representations. Poetry, Poe agrees completely with Blake, opens the doors of perception so that we might give full attention to the human condition within the poetic condition, where everything is to be endured but nothing further can be done. From this experience of poetic illusion emerges an irritable reaching after fact and reason that can only be addressed beyond the patrolled borders of poetry in the living world of politics and ethics. So conceived, poetry is sometimes called art for art's sake. Its escapism is its struggle to enter the impossible world of worldly illusions, ideology, and imagine that the cost of living in those illusions, which, like one of the best known, the American dream, appear so beautiful to us that we work daily to perpetuate them. But woe 'tis so. For Poe, however, such beauties are always also fearful. Their truth is the catastrophe their shadowed eyes remember and foresee. That's the end of chapter 2. Have we learned much here? I don't think so. Don't think we've learned very much, bruv. Not much is left of this book. About halfway through. Yeah, approximately halfway through. What do you think, bruv? What do you got? And that's a big fat fucking nothing as far as participants are concerned, so I will close this motherfucker, rightly so.